Welcome to the Emerging Civil War Podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me from Christopher Newport University is Jonathan White. Jonathan, how are you today?
I'm good.
It's delightful to have you with us finally. This is actually the first time that you and I have met. We've been in the same circles for a long time, and and many good friends mutually. But I'm glad to finally have the chance to sit down and talk with you about a couple really cool projects you have going on.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I've been listening recently, really enjoying the podcast, and I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, delighted, delighted. So now, in one of your many capacities, you work with the Lincoln Forum. You serve
Mhm.
as a vice chair for the Lincoln Forum, and you've been working on two, I think, really cool, unique Lincoln-related projects that we're going to talk about today. But let me kind of start there with Lincoln himself. What is it that has attracted you to spend so much time with this titan of American history?
That's a great question. I really fell into being a Lincoln guy. I often get that question about how did I become a Lincoln guy. I was always interested in American history. I actually grew up in a house outside of Philadelphia from the 1720s, and when I was a kid, I found the old trash pit out back and dug up all sorts of old things. And the stuff of history is what really got me interested. And then my grandfather would tell me stories about our family history. He would say we were related to Irvin McDowell. I've never proven that, and I don't know if I'd want to claim that anyway, but I sort of had that Civil War bug and that history bug as a kid. And when I got to college, I started as a business major, but I very quickly switched to history. I wanted to make a lot of money, and I still would like to make a lot of money, but my passion was just for history and the Civil War. Gary Gallagher was still there at Penn State when I was an undergrad. And so I got to meet him and talk to him a little bit. But then when he left, Bill Blair and Mark Neely came to Penn State. And Mark, of course, is a Pulitzer Prize winning Lincoln scholar. And so I began to learn more about Abraham Lincoln studying under Mark. But even when I got to graduate school at the University of Maryland, I was still really focused on Civil War politics broadly and not on Lincoln. And it wasn't until 2009 that I got to Christopher Newport University and I began teaching and I started incorporating Lincoln into more of my classes. And then I went to a Lincoln conference and I met Matt Pinksker there. And when I met Matt, I said, when I was researching my dissertation, I found this letter that John Merryman wrote describing why he burned railroad bridges in April of 1861. And no one had ever seen that letter before. And I told him about it, and he said, "Well, John, you got to do something with that." And so I came back to CNU and I started writing. And I started off by writing a short piece, eventually expanded into about 30 pages. And I sent it to Mark Neely. And he said, "This is really important, this letter, but you've got too much going on in this 30-page, draft of an article." So he said, "You either need to cut it in half and turn it into two articles or expand it into a book." And I figured, well, I'd rather have a book than two articles. And so I spent the next couple of months working on it. And I ended up turning it into my first monograph, which is called Abraham Lincoln and Treason in the Civil War, The Trials of John Merryman. And it's this history of the bridge burning around Baltimore during the first months of the Civil War, and then the court cases that emerged out of it. And this letter written by John Merryman that I'd found became a central piece of the puzzle that explained what was going on here more than scholars in the past had known. And when I wrote that book, Lincoln organizations began to invite me to give talks. And there's not a lot of young people who, I was young then, I feel old now, but I was young then, not a lot of people in their 30s who are publishing books about Lincoln. And so they began to invite me to do talks and liked my presentations. And then they would invite me to do other things and then invite me to join their organizations as board members and vice chair of the Lincoln Forum. And as they welcomed me in, I became a Lincoln guy. So it was really serendipitous. I mean, it was always this love of the Civil War and studying it, and then finding this letter that led to a book that led to invitations that ever since I've focused mostly on Lincoln.
It's one of those really neat stories where one door opens another, opens another, opens another, and you've got the talent to position yourself to be able to take advantage of those opportunities when they open up for you. What a cool story. So now that you've spent so much time with Lincoln, and I'm assuming you'll have plenty more time to spend with him, but now that you've spent so much time with him, what's he like?
It's a great question. He'd be a really fun guy to hang out with, especially, I think, the pre-war Lincoln. People often ask me, "Oh, if you could have dinner with Lincoln, would you, or if you could have dinner with anyone, who would it be?" And then they naturally expect me to say Lincoln. And but the twist I've added to it is I would love to meet the young Abraham Lincoln, the guy in his 20s or 30s who was hardworking, developing himself as a politician and a lawyer, but who was really funny. He told great stories, very funny jokes, off-color jokes. I mean, some of his friends had written versions of some of the jokes he would tell, and they destroyed them because they thought, this would tarnish his reputation after he's died. And so some of the stories are lost to history, but we still get the sense that he would have been just a really fun person to hang out with. So Lincoln in his 20s or 30s would be a pretty interesting guy to know.
I love that twist. And most people, have at least heard of Lincoln's sense of humor, but for you to describe him as a fun guy, I mean, that's a kind of a side of Lincoln most of us probably don't realize.
Yeah, I mean, he's very famous for being a good wrestler. And so when he's hanging out with the guys, sometimes they're wrestling or they would make him their champion and he would wrestle the champion of another group of guys. He could swap stories. He loved talking politics. And so he was just while he did certainly struggle with what we would today call depression or some mental health issues. So he had that side of him, but then he had this other side where he was just someone that everyone liked to be around.
And I suppose it's fair to say that 4 years of Civil War makes a person a little heavier, a little more somber, a little sadder. So that later Lincoln might not be the fun guy to hang around with, considering everything else he's had to go through. Um,
Especially losing a son. I mean, he had lost a son in the 1850s, but then he lost Willie in 1862. And that changed the whole tone of the White House after Willie dies. And you have to imagine that he really suffered from that. And I think he then buried himself in his work even more, and that really changed the nature of how he interacted with people and his. I mean, he still told funny stories and jokes and those things, but the whole feel of the White House, I get the sense that it changed after February of 62.
And, looking at photos of Lincoln through that era, you can sort of see this baleful sadness in his eyes. And, maybe that's part of reading into it or, buying into some stereotypes we have about him. But it is hard to imagine him going forward, after that terrible tragedy, plus the tragedy of the war going on and him not being affected that way.
Yeah, well, and Harold Holzer, who you have coming to Emerging Civil War in 2025, did this wonderful presentation years ago where he showed the photographs of Lincoln throughout his life. And you see just how much he ages between 1861 and 1865. I mean, he doesn't even look like the same man in a lot of ways because of that toll that the war took on him.
Yeah. Now, one of the books that we're going to talk about today really sort of gives us a similar sort of snapshot of Lincoln over time, as you've collected some great accounts about and by Lincoln that you've put together for us. The book's called A Great and Good Man, and it's a collection of things about Lincoln that you and your co-editor have found and assembled. Tell us a little bit about this really neat collection, because I'm fascinated by the origin story and all this, which we'll get into here. But tell us a little bit about the collection as a whole.
Yeah, so there's a guy named William J. Griffin, and he goes by Griff, who created a website called Spared and Shared. And I imagine that a lot of your listeners are familiar with this site. And if you're not, you should find it on Facebook and follow him because it's incredible. So Griff was in the chemical safety industry for, I guess, about 30 years. And he retired about 15 years ago. And when he retired, I think he'd always been a Civil War collector, but he started going on eBay and realized there are so many letters that document that period of history that are being kind of lost to historians and to scholars because they show up for 7 days and then they disappear. And they might show up again 10 or 20 years later, but for all intents and purposes, they're gone. And so he had this idea where he reached out to a seller and he said, I got this thought. Send me scans of the letters and I will transcribe them and annotate them. So I'll do a little bit of research on them and then I'll send you the transcriptions and annotations back. And the deal was you give me, Griff, permission to put it on my website, spared and shared. So the scan and the transcription. And then when you use the transcription in your auction, it'll generate more interest because keywords will come up when people are searching. And to his surprise, the seller said, that's a great idea. Sure. And so in the last 15 years, Griff has transcribed over 15,000 Civil War letters and diaries. And I found out about this 2 summers ago. And then last fall, I got in touch with him because I started to follow him on Facebook, and he posted a letter by a man in Illinois who described how he felt in the wake of the Lincoln assassination and how he had felt when he went to a play at Ford's Theater in 1864. And he was there at Ford's when they announced that Atlanta had fallen. And so he was kind of this man was reflecting on the difference in how Ford's would have been in September of 64 versus April of 65. It was a really incredible letter. And so I reached out to Griff and I said, hey, I'm editor of the Lincoln Forum Bulletin. Would you want to publish that letter with a little introduction about spared and shared in the bulletin? We have 1,000 members. It'll get you some attention, maybe some new followers. And he said, that'd be great. So I ran that last fall. And then this spring, I reached out to him because I just wanted to meet him. And so we had a Zoom and we talked for 2 hours. And I said to him, I said, you have whole books here. Like he has whole collections, or he has, hundreds of letters about particular battles. And I said, you could turn these into books. And he said, oh, well, I created a page of all the quotes about Abraham Lincoln. And I said, send it to me. So he sent it to me. And while he and I were talking, I downloaded the whole thing to a Word doc, and it came out to 93 pages. And I said, well, Griff, I've got an offer. How about this? Do you want to turn this into a book and we'll co-edit it? And he loved the idea. And so we did it. And that was in May, this past May. So from May until July, I worked with a very talented student of mine named Lainey, and Lainey and I sat here in my office and just proofread every transcription against the original scans, and then worked on the annotation, and we added a few more accounts. And I'm happy to say that right when we started this call, I got an email from my editor saying, so we're good to go to the printer, right? And as we were just starting our conversation, I typed back, I said, yep, I think we're good to go. So the book is going to the printer now, and it's coming out in October. So it's probably the fastest turnaround of a book I've ever had, but I'm so excited about it because these are accounts of Lincoln that have never really seen the light of day.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you, like, how is this different than a collection like Lincoln Remembered that collects all these different accounts that people have said, and some of the most famous anecdotes about Lincoln have come from a collection like that. So how is this collection different or similar to that, those
Yeah,
pre-existing collections?
it's different in that Griff has created his own archive by going through eBay. And it's funny, in 2006, I published an essay in the news magazine of the American Historical Association. And I made the case that scholars should be using eBay for historical research. And I've always done this. And because you find things that will change the way we think about the Civil War, but you have to be willing to constantly search on eBay because it's a dynamic database. It's always changing. Things are there for 7 days and then they're gone. But if you're willing to patiently do that, you can create archives that no one else would have access to. And we all, I think, all of us who are listening or talking here know people, and maybe ourselves included, who have found that incredible source on eBay or that photograph. Like I think of Chuck Joyce, the photograph collector, who found that image of the, I think, 11 Black soldiers who were all identified in Alexandria, Virginia, that was featured in Military Images magazine a few years back. Like he found that on eBay. And if he hadn't found it and then made it available to the public, we wouldn't know about an extraordinary image like that. So the book is unique in that it's probably the only archive that's been made out of eBay and then pulled together into a book like this. And Griff and I have some plans for some other books that we're going to do next. And then the other thing that I think is different is that almost all of the accounts are from between 1858 and 1866. There's one from 1912 and one from 1927. And we included them just because they were really good. One was about the Battle of Fort Stevens in 1864, where Lincoln is under fire. And then the other one was a bandmaster who recalled Lincoln coming to camp and saying, "Play Dixie. We've won it back now at the end of the war." And so it's we're going to claim it as a Union prize. So we included those two accounts as well. But other than that, everything is from Lincoln's lifetime or immediately after the assassination and burial period, because in studying Lincoln, there are so many memoirs and recollections that are suspect because they're told years later, and you just wonder, like, I don't remember the conversations I had with people 2 or 3 days ago, and yet some of the recollections of Lincoln, yeah, 40 years ago Lincoln said this to me, and you get 2 pages of exact transcription of what Lincoln said, and it's like, do you really want to believe that? I don't know. But in this case, these are letters and diaries that were written in the moment, and I think that gives them more credibility or reliability.
Yeah. I've just been working on some stuff on Stonewall Jackson, and it's amazing. You read the letters of the Valley campaign in '62, and these guys are like marching and their feet are sore. And it's a much different version of Stonewall Jackson than 40 years later when they're thinking about their glory days in the Valley and how awesome it was.
Yeah.
It's amazing how those 40 years and a bunch of success and martyrdom changed people's perspectives about him. And Lincoln is certainly susceptible to all of those sorts of forces too.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And you think about, most of what we know about Lincoln's early life comes from his law partner, Billy Herndon. And when Lincoln died, Herndon wanted to create a biography of him, which he eventually published. And so he began interviewing anyone he could find who had known Lincoln in Kentucky or Indiana or early Illinois years. And those interviews and letters have been published as a book called Herndon's Informants, and it's invaluable. I mean, you can't write about Lincoln and not use those sources. But at the same time, you have to view those recollections from the 1860s and 70s of what did Lincoln say in the 1820s and 30s. You have to view them with a little bit of reserve and skepticism, I think.
And I think people are also a little hesitant in the immediate aftermath of his assassination to speak ill of the dead or perhaps to glorify or accentuate that. And that's not to take anything away from Lincoln, but these are
Right.
just sort of the forces of human nature that kind of tug at people, I think.
Well, and related to that, to also accentuate their own role in his life. So you often find that people, because Lincoln is now this martyr and this larger than life figure, they want themselves to be at the center of his story. So they were the person who was in the room when something important happened.
Yeah, yeah. So, as you collected these quotes, and it must have just been a lot of fun for you to discover these things, for yourself as a Lincoln guy for the first time reading through these.
Mhm.
Walk me through that process of discovery and exploration.
Yeah, so we started with this 93-page document that I cut and pasted off of Griff's website. And he took this, for anyone who's wanting to find it, we took that page down since when we decided to do the book. So that page is no longer out there. And I began to read through these accounts, and I was finding things that I had never seen before. So the one that really jumps out to me is an account of a soldier who is in the army in Virginia in September of 1861, and he describes Lincoln coming into camp and then going to the cook's tent and going to the cook's fire and lighting up a cigar with the boys. I have never, ever read of Lincoln as president lighting up a cigar. And he didn't say he smoked it, so maybe he didn't inhale. I don't know. But there's Lincoln lighting up a cigar with the soldiers. You find a lot of men who write about Lincoln coming to the field and having a review and how he looks to them. So a lot of them say, oh, they call him ugly, but he doesn't look as ugly as people say he does. He looks like his picture. My favorite account, though, was someone who said he looks like a shark. And I don't even know what that means, Lincoln looking like a shark. So we started with that 93-page document, and I had these accounts in there. And when Lainey and I started proofreading them, we would look at the original letters and we would look at what surrounded the excerpts that Griff had originally selected. And we then would say, oh, you know what, this is really interesting. Some of the letters talk about other cabinet officials, and we want this book to be not only a good read for enthusiasts and Civil War buffs, but for Lincoln scholars and writers to be able to say, I'm working on Lincoln's cabinet, I want accounts of them too. So there were some places where Griff had taken out the excerpt on Lincoln, but then right after that was a really great quote about Seward or Wells or Cameron. And so Laney and I then added those things in. And our publisher, I was originally aiming for about 25,000 words. I wanted it to be a very slim, kind of short book. And the publisher said, well, if you can get it to 40 or 50,000 words, that would be ideal, because they want it to be a nice kind of book that people can have on their shelves and it'll look really sharp. And so the publisher allowed us to include 40 or 50 images, which
Yes.
is, but they're beautiful. And that really fleshed out the book as well. And some of them are kind of standard, here's, you know, Seward or Chase or other major figures. But then some of them are rarer images that we were able to include. One of them from a private collection. So one of the letters, there's a whole set of letters about the assassination. And one of the letters describes it was written in Chattanooga in, I think, April, May 65. And it describes these guys who were in the Union Army who celebrated Lincoln's assassination. And I'd read about them in the past, and I wrote a little bit about them in a piece I did in 2015. But Griff found this letter describing them. And there's a photograph in a private collection of these guys wearing, for their punishment was they had to wear placards that said assassination sympathizer, and there's a photograph of them. And so I was able to contact Ron Coddington, who's the ultimate Civil War photography collector. I said, Ron, do you know who owns that image, and can you put me in touch with him? He said, yeah, it's this guy, and here's his email. And so I was able to get permission to use that. So tracking down the images was a lot of fun. And then the last piece that we did, I've been researching Lincoln specifically since 2009 and Civil War more broadly for over 20 years. And I have all of my notes on my computer. And so I went through all my notes looking for accounts of Lincoln that have not been published. And then we put those in as well. So a very small handful of the accounts in the book are not from eBay, but they're good enough that we wanted to include them. So one I'll tell you about. Last year, I published a book called Shipwrecked, and it's a biography of a man who was convicted of slave trading. His name was Appleton Oaksmith. And Appleton Oaksmith's mother was a very prominent writer, poet, essayist, playwright in the 19th century and first wave feminist. And on April 13th, 1865, she was invited to give a speech on April 14th to commemorate the end of the war. And there's a little bit of irony in this because she was a Democrat and she grew to hate Lincoln because she believed that the Lincoln administration was persecuting her son and by having him arrested for slave trading and convicted and all this stuff. So she agrees to give this speech, and during her speech at 10 p.m. on April 14th, 1865, she begins to feel these like chest pains and her face goes pale. And afterwards, someone in the audience comes up to her and says, are you all right? I could see how your body was just in pain. And she went home and she wrote about it in her diary. And then the next day, word arrives in her little village on Long Island that Lincoln has been killed and that he was shot right after 10 p.m. And so, I thought, I wrote about that in Shipwrecked, my biography of Appleton Oaksmith, but the diary itself has never been fully published. And so I took those two excerpts, April 14th, where she describes the pain, and then April 15th, where she learns about Lincoln's death. And I thought that's a great way to then introduce the letters that follow of all the people mourning Lincoln's death or a few people celebrating Lincoln's death. I mean, there was one woman who was a Democrat in New York, and she describes, I'm really sad that Lincoln died, but they're blaming Democrats for it. And that kind of ticks me off. That's kind of the position she has. Or another person, I think in New York, who describes having friends over, and this one woman who comes to her house is like, yeah, it's so great that Lincoln was killed. And the dad kicks her out of the house. So most of the accounts are mourning Lincoln and then watching his funeral procession go through different cities of the North. But there are a few people whose letters went through eBay who don't mourn in the same way as most Americans did.
Yeah. I want to go back to just something you'd said a few minutes ago when you were talking about the images. And I thought it was just a beautifully designed book. It's really an attractive book to have. And I really like the way that the designer used a lot of those images, that powerful picture of Lincoln at Cooper Union in 1860 to introduce the letters from that year. And it was just,
Mhm.
I thought, just an exceptionally laid out and designed book. So kudos to the team that helped you out with that.
They're first rate, and I'll tell you, I've tinkered with it since the version that I sent you, so I'm even more happy with the layout now. There's one image that a lot of your listeners have probably seen. It's the only photograph of Lincoln post-mortem. So Mary Lincoln said, "I don't want any photographs taken of my husband as the open casket funeral is going from city to city." But in New York, Jeremiah Gurney was allowed to sneak a photo, and when it was found out, it was confiscated and it wound up kind of disappearing, and everyone thought all the copies were destroyed. And then in the 1950s, I think, a kid was doing research at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. It wasn't called that back then, but in Springfield, and came across this photo tucked away in a collection of papers, and it became well known. That kid grew up to become a Lincoln Scholar, actually. And the photo is extraordinary. So when they originally designed it, it was like this big.
Oh yeah.
And then they had Lincoln's patent drawing as a full page. And I said, all right, hold on. The patent drawing's cool, but it's not the most important thing. Make this post-mortem image the full page and the patent image like a third of a page. So they switched a few things around. Yeah, the images I think really bring the letters to life.
Yeah, yeah. There was a great presidential ballot you had in there that had what Buchanan and Breckinridge on it, which I thought, I'd never seen that before. That was neat. And from
That
your
one I found at
collection,
the New York
yeah,
Public Library.
yeah.
They have, for researchers interested in this sort of thing, the New York Public Library has an incredible collection of ballots from probably the 1840s to the 1920s. And I went up there a year or two ago and went through the whole thing and just snapped probably about 50 pictures. There's some really fun ones in there.
And I like the rally of the wide awakes that you had too. That was kind of my other thing that really jumped out again. Just a lot of little things just I'd never seen before that I thought really enhanced the collection of texts that you had pulled together. So
Yeah.
it was really cool. So, I want to kind of go back to spared and shared for a second because, I'm assuming I've never met Griff, but I'm just amazed by what he's been able to pull together and the idea that these letters have been spared from obscurity and shared with the public, which is
Mhm.
where the idea comes from. Um, and you had made a great argument, back in the early 2000s about using eBay in just this sort of way to collect stuff. Now that you have some physical, tangible product of that argument you had originally laid
Yeah.
out, tell me what reaction was from people who, when you say eBay, this is a great collection of stuff. Griff is proving that it is, but like, what was the reception you got to this argument that, there's a lot of good stuff to plumb here?
Yeah, I wrote that article in 2006 when I was in graduate school, and I actually, in the article, I described the embarrassment I felt when sharing with a colleague or a professor of mine that I had found this source on eBay. Because I think for a lot of more old school, especially 20 years ago, databases were still sort of in their infancy. People weren't, today our mindset is if you're going to research something, first thing you do is you Google it. That wasn't the way you approached things in 2006 when I started to think about eBay in this way. But I think that people are starting to come around to this idea. And in fact, a little bit of confirmation of that is that I found there's a manual for writing history papers for undergraduates, and I got a copy of it a few years ago, and I found that they cited my article on using eBay as a historical database. So whoever wrote that manual for undergrads sort of recognized, okay, undergrads are going to naturally go to the internet first, and you of course have to be wary of anything you find on the internet. You got to do due diligence, but part of going to the internet is going to sites like eBay. And so I think that I've found more and more scholars who are doing this, and maybe some of them I've kind of pushed to do this. I have friends I'm like, you got to go on eBay and look. But I have a friend and colleague and neighbor. His office is two doors that way, named Frank Garman, and he just published an incredible book of a con artist during the Civil War with LSU Press, and it's called A Wonderful Career in Crime.
Yeah.
Now, the con artist was really slippery, and Frank couldn't find any images that for sure were of him. But he went on eBay and started to find sources. And then he also found photographs of some of the more obscure people who come up in the story. And he was able to buy them. And the beauty of when you own your own image is you don't have to worry about rights and permissions fees and any of that. Like, oftentimes, buying an image on eBay is less expensive than paying the $100 fee to the library or archive that has the same exact image. And so my colleague Frank Garman was able to buy some images that he then used as illustrations in his book.
Oh, wow, that's cool. Now, I would think though, using the internet, of course, comes with all of its own sets of things to be careful about, information literacy challenges and things like that. But I think eBay might pose a special challenge in that you're looking for something, and then oh wait, look, there's this other really cool thing, and oh wait, I want, so there's that rabbit hole trap to eBay.
Yeah, that's right. Or the worst is when you find something that just sold and it's too late to get it. A couple years ago, I published a set of letters of a black soldier in the 3rd U.S. Colored Infantry, and we published them in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography. And afterward, I went online and I was doing research on this guy, and I found that 2 cabinet cards of him, one in his GAR uniform and one as a Mason, had sold on eBay for nothing, and I had missed out. And then another, I did a book a couple years ago called My Work Among the Freedmen, and it's the letters of a woman who was a teacher for freed slaves in South Carolina, Virginia, and North Carolina during the Civil War and Reconstruction. There's no image of her that survives, and there's almost nothing of hers that survives. And right after I published the book, I found that the sampler she made as a little girl with Bible verses and letters of the alphabet and so forth had sold for $300.
uh,
And then this sampler dealer, because I guess there are such things, bought it, and then he listed it for $3,000. And I thought, well, I would have paid 300 for it just to have this piece connecting me to her since I've spent a couple years working on her stuff. But 3,000 is a little bit out of my college professor budget, so I had to let that one go, and someone else bought it.
yeah, that reminds me of that old ABC sports phrase, "the agony of defeat," right
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
Yep.
So
There's a lot
now,
of, I'll tell you my worst one. Oh, this crushes me. So a number of years ago, I met an elderly woman who had never married, had no kids, and she gave me her father's World War I letters and medals,
uh,
her grandfather's 1890s Marine letters from when he was stationed in Hawaii, and her great grandfather's Civil War letters, and the bullets that he was wounded with at Gettysburg, and a piece of his regimental flag. And he served with the 153rd Pennsylvania.
wow.
And a few years ago, I allowed one of my students to transcribe the letters, and we published them with photographs of all these artifacts in Civil War News. And so I was always kind of interested in, I grew up in Pennsylvania, so I grew up going to Gettysburg and was always kind of interested in Gettysburg, and then became very interested in the 153rd when I got this guy's effects. Well, one day I came across a letter that was written on July 3rd, 1863, on the battlefield of Gettysburg by a member of the 153rd Pennsylvania. And I went on vacation, and this was before I had a smartphone. This was probably about 8 or 9 years ago. And we went on vacation. We were in the woods, no internet or anything. And I totally forgot about the letter. And I remembered just a little bit too late. And when I finally got to a place where I had internet, it had sold. Now, I didn't think I had a chance of winning this thing, because a letter written at the battlefield during the battle, you figure is going to go for 5 grand. No one else bid. It sold for $20. And
Uh,
talk about the agony of defeat. And I so badly would have known, did that letter mention, Horatio, now why did I just totally blank on his last name? The guy whose letters I have. Like, it might
yeah.
have mentioned his name, but I'll never know.
Oh, that's crushing.
20 bucks.
$20. Oh. So, well, I had mentioned that you actually have two books to
Yeah.
talk about today, and what I really kind of think is you've got sort of readers at both ends of the spectrum here. Um, Over your left shoulder in the background is the cover for the second book we'd like to talk about today, My Day with Abe Lincoln, which you've written as your first children's book. So
Yep.
a different way to look at Lincoln. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I have two daughters. They are 8 and 11. And for years, I've been telling them stories at bedtime. And then we also probably have over 200 history books for kids. And so I've been reading to them since infancy. And I wanted to kind of take these two areas of my life, my love of history and my love of storytelling for kids, and kind of bring them together. And my original idea was to write an article about Lincoln's early life. And I started to work on that and research it. But I thought there's a lot of kids book article or kids magazine articles like that. And there's a lot of kids books that are like that, just sort of a here's what happened day by day or something. And so I wound up coming up with a different idea. I wanted to make it more of an adventure. And so I created a fictional character named Lucy Milloway. And Lucy throws a tantrum on a Monday morning. And I know you've got young kids, so you've probably experienced this where it's Monday morning and the kids just don't want to go to school and they throw a tantrum. And so in this story, Lucy throws a fit and she figures, well, maybe if I dress in the silliest outfit I can come up with, they won't let me go to school. And so she does this. And to top it off, she takes the magic hat from her brother's magic kit and she puts it on her head. And when she does that, she's transported back in time to Spencer County, Indiana in the 1820s. And she then goes through the day with Abe and his sister Sarah. She goes to school with them. She goes home and has dinner with them. She meets his dad and his stepmom, and she learns a lot about him. And what I like to tell people, everything in the story is 100% historically accurate, except for two things. The first is the time travel. And then the second is at the end, she gives the hat to Lincoln, and he's like, oh, this is so great. And when he puts it on, she comes back to the present. And so, and then she's transformed. Now she is excited to go to school and learn more about Lincoln. And so it's really a fun, different way to get at the Lincoln story and to get kids interested in Lincoln and to see him as more human than just if you take them to the Lincoln Memorial and say, look at that giant statue. He doesn't seem real in that case, but I've been really pleased with how it's done. And the reviews on Amazon have been great. And what's been really fun about those is a lot of parents are having their kids say, what did you think? And then the parents type it into the review. And even one, I have no idea who left this, obviously, but one grandpa said, my wife got this for the grandkids, and I saw it on the table, and I just had to read it first, and I loved it. And so, and then he wrote a nice review about it. So it's been great to kind of see that it's resonating. And I think we all who love history, we hope that we can find ways to get young people interested. And so this is kind of my attempt to reach my kids' generation.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit more about that because, of course, I hear it all the time traveling around. People say we've got to get more young kids involved. We got to get more young people involved. What's your general perception of that as far as just young people interested or not in history?
I think we have some major hurdles to overcome. I mean, I think part of it is that a lot of times the teachers that kids have in their early education are either boring. And nothing against anyone listening. If you're listening to this podcast and you're a teacher, you are not one of those people. But I mean, I have so many. I do a lot of work for retirees actually, and I have so many retirees come up to me and say, if only I'd had a teacher like you when I was younger, I would have liked history. And I have students who come up to me and say kind of the same thing. They'll say, oh, I wish I had had a teacher who was as enthusiastic as you are when I was in elementary school or high school. So I think part of it is, some of the teachers getting these kids when they're young, it's just about names and dates. And you got to memorize the names and the dates, and that's all history is to them. And if you lose the story, you lose everything, and you certainly lose the chance to kind of draw them in. I mean, the thing about it is the stories of history, I think, are more interesting than fiction.
Yeah.
And yet it's so hard to get those really interesting stories to young people in a way that will captivate their imagination. And then I think the other thing is, and STEM is obviously really important, technology and kids learning that, but kids aren't reading as much. And if they're not reading as much, they're not going to get the education they need. And a lot of school districts and states are talking about getting rid of early American history, just kind of starting post Civil War. You cut out the American Revolution, you cut out the Civil War, you're losing a lot. And if all the focus is on just, well, learn how to program computers and use AI because that's what will get you the job, then if that's what kids are being told, then I think they're going to naturally gravitate in those ways. And so we've got to find ways to get them kind of back into the world of history. I mean, look at Lincoln. This is something that comes out in my kids' book. So when Lincoln was president-elect in 1861, he made this trip around the North on his way to Washington, D.C., and he stopped in Trenton, New Jersey to give a speech in the New Jersey State Senate. And as part of he's right there in Trenton, and he says, I remember reading as a boy about Washington crossing the Delaware and fighting the Hessians. And he has this incredible line where he says, it stayed with me my whole life. I'm paraphrasing here, but he's like, as all these good stories, and he says to them, because they're all men at that point, he says, you all know what I'm talking about because you were boys once. Like, I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what he says. And it's like, yeah, if you can capture the imagination of a child with a true story about American history, it'll stay with them just like it did with Lincoln.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm especially excited about with your book, when as you're talking about ways to hook young people, when my two oldest were young, and would go to battlefields and they wanted books and there just weren't a lot out there,
Yeah.
and so having something that's available, something that's especially so well done, it's a huge difference just to make something available to hook their interest and grab their attention and spark that lifelong interest that you talked about.
Yeah, there are a lot of wonderful books available now, more than there were when we were younger, for sure. And it is a good thing. I've found that, sadly, some historic sites have really cut back on the books that they carry, which I won't name names. I mean, I could, but it breaks my heart because that parents who bring their kids want to find good books to take home with them. And some of these site administrators have just decided, oh, we don't want those kind of books anymore, which I think is tragic. The other thing I did with My Day with Abe Lincoln is I created a free teacher and parent guide. And it's available at my website, which is jonathanwhite.org, and it's available at the press's website, which is Reedy Press. And chapter by chapter, I give the real history behind each story that gets told. And a lot of the quotes in the book are real quotes from the Lincoln Record. And that way, if a parent or grandparent or teacher is reading this with their kids, if the kids say, did this really happen? Is this really true? The parent or teacher can now be the expert and say, yeah, actually, this is what happened. And I mentioned the Trenton speech. So in the book, Lincoln talks about his love of George Washington. And in the teacher guide, I put that whole Trenton speech so that if a teacher wants to then give that to their students and say, let's look at what Lincoln really said about Washington crossing the Delaware, they can have that resource at their fingertips. And my hope is that it'll enhance the classroom and the love of learning among kids.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. I Tell me about actually creating the book, because the illustrations are beautiful. What was it like to match your words up with an artist and kind of come to this common vision?
So I went to the head of the art department here at CNU, and I said, do you have any talented art students who might be interested in illustrating a book? And she said, well, let me ask the visual arts professors. And both of them recommended the same student. So I reached out to the student. We got coffee and I explained the vision of the book. I gave her a copy of the text as it was at that time. And I said, if you want to do this, I'd love to have you do it. And we were able to apply for a grant through CNU. So she got paid way more money than I'll ever make off this book to do the illustrations. And it was just a great relationship. She would come into my office or we'd meet at the coffee shop. and I'd bring my girls in and we would just sit down together and my girls would give their input about how they wanted the illustrations to look, and we worked them into the book in two different places. And so it was a lot of fun for them, and for a college student to then be able to have in her resume that she published with a real trade press, I think is a great thing. As she now moves forward out of college and into her career, she can point to something that she can be really proud of. So it was just a wonderful experience, I think, for all of us to be able to collaborate in this way.
Yeah. Well, and to hear that that's a student, and that's not to disparage student work at all, since you and I both work with them every day, but I certainly thought it was a well-seasoned professional artist who had done the work, because I mean, they are beautiful, lovely illustrations in that book.
Yeah, she did her, I will say she did her research. So when she needed to draw the Lincoln Cabin, she went online and found lots of images of the recreated Lincoln Cabin in Indiana. Or when she needed to draw, there's this story that Lincoln told when he was running for president. When he was about 9 or 10 years old, he was kicked in the head by a horse while he was grinding grain at a mill. And so she went online and found 19th century mills. What did they look like? And then tried to recreate it. So she really did due diligence and wanted to make it as realistic as possible, and yet have the images have a sense of fun and whimsy to them, which I think you can kind of see in the front cover where they are walking. For those who are watching online, you can kind of see. And then I can hold up, like, here is the main character wearing her hat. Just very fun kind of images of the characters. And the other thing she did, she took photographs of Lincoln from different periods, and then she tried to sort of think, if I take him back further, what would he look like when he's about 12 or 13 years old? And she tried to kind of get those features right for him too.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, I think most people don't realize Lincoln was actually only 35 when he was elected, and he was aged so terribly by the war that he looks like he's 100. That's all. So the kids' book is My Day with Abe Lincoln. The book of collected quotes and accounts is called A Good and Great Man.
A great and good man.
A Great and Good Man. That's right. Let me get that correct. And tell us how we can find these books.
So they're available on sites like Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million. There, some of them. My Day with Abe Lincoln is carried in a lot of Lincoln sites, so you can get it at the Lincoln Home in Springfield or at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, sites like that. A Great and Good Man comes out October 15th, so it's available for pre-order online or through Reedy Press. And so I'm gonna I'm excited. I'm gonna be using it in class this fall. One of the reasons I really rushed it through was I love the documents so much that I think they'll be engaging for students. And so as we're reading Lincoln speeches, we're gonna read these accounts along with them. And so I've told my students, got to pre-order. And I said, I don't do it for the money. I said to the class, I said, it's a class of 100 or so. I said, I'll probably make $18 off of this. So I'm going to take those royalties and buy you all donuts one day. So I'm not doing it for the money. I just want to get it into people's hands.
Nothing like a good donut bribe. I think that's perfect.
Exactly.
Well, I wish you the best of luck with the new book. And my son Maxwell and I are going to be sitting down with a day with Abe Lincoln here starting this weekend.
Oh,
So
great.
super, super excited about that. John, what a pleasure to finally sit down and chat with you today.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. My pleasure. I'm Chris Mikowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.